The fluorescent lights in the glass conference room burn harsh and clinical at 1:22 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. I've been awake for 21 hours straight, finishing the operational roadmap for the merger that's supposed to close in 6 weeks. HR texted me 30 minutes ago asking me to come down for a quick meeting before heading home. Now I'm sitting across from the VP of Human Resources and the Director of Talent Management, both looking exhausted but professionally composed. They slide 2 folders across the polished table. "We're finalizing retention agreements tonight," the VP says, her voice carefully neutral. "You and Cameron are both critical to the transition, and we wanted to get these to you personally." I open my folder. The letter inside is printed on company letterhead, formal and official. My retention bonus, $30,000, paid in 2 installments over 18 months, contingent on staying through merger completion and performance benchmarks. Before I can respond, the director adds almost casually, Cameron's bonus came in at $70,000. His role has been identified as high impact for the integration phase. The words hit me like ice water. $70,000. Cameron, my mentee. The person I personally trained from his first confused day 3 years ago. The person who still comes to my office when he's stuck on complex problems. They're paying him more than twice what they're paying me. The sting settles deep in my chest, sharp and undeniable. I close the folder slowly, stand up, and say, "Thank you for the information. I need to process this." I walk out into the empty hallway without another word. 3 years and 2 months ago, Cameron walked into the office on his first day looking nervous and overwhelmed. He was 26, fresh from a graduate program in business analytics, carrying a leather portfolio that still had the price tag tucked inside. Leadership assigned him to my team specifically because I had a track record of developing junior talent into productive contributors. "Show him the ropes," my manager said. "We hired him for potential, but he needs someone to turn that into performance." I spent the first 6 months doing exactly that. Teaching him our client management systems, walking him through revenue modeling frameworks, explaining the institutional nuances that don't appear in any manual. When he made mistakes, and he made plenty early on, I corrected them quietly before they became visible to leadership. When layoffs came through during the budget crisis 18 months ago and junior staff were being cut across divisions, I made the case to keep Cameron, arguing that his analytical skills would be critical for upcoming projects. I handed him real work, important projects that would give him visibility. When he did well, I made sure leadership noticed. When clients gave positive feedback on his presentations, I forwarded those emails to the executive team with Cameron's name highlighted. I believed in mentorship as investment. I believed that building people up would create loyalty, that the organization would recognize the value of developing talent, that doing the right thing would matter in the long run. Looking at that $30,000 retention offer, I realize how wrong I was. 8 months ago, a new director joined the company from a high-growth tech firm. Her name was Allison Vance, and she came in with a mandate to modernize our culture and accelerate innovation. Her first all-hands presentation was full of phrases like fresh energy, disruptive thinking, and breaking legacy patterns. She talked about building the company's future, about empowering the next generation of leaders, about moving past outdated approaches that slowed us down. Within weeks, I noticed the shift. Younger employees were suddenly getting pulled into strategic planning sessions. People with 3 years of tenure were presenting to the executive team. Meanwhile, those of us who'd been around longer, who'd built the systems these younger employees were now using, were increasingly relegated to execution roles. We implemented. They strategized. The director framed it as leveraging different strengths, but the pattern was unmistakable. Experience was becoming something to work around rather than something to tap into. Senior staff were quietly being positioned as the old guard, people who'd done good work but whose time was passing. I tried to dismiss it as adjustment period friction, but the unease settled in and stayed. 6 months ago, I was refilling my coffee in the break room when I heard voices from the hallway. The director and the VP of operations were standing just around the corner, visible through the doorway but unaware I was there. "Cameron is exactly the kind of leader we need to build around," the director said. "Sharp, adaptable, hungry to prove himself. He represents the future of this division." The VP agreed enthusiastically. We should make sure he's locked in for the merger. Whatever it takes to keep him engaged and committed. They talked for another minute about Cameron's potential, his trajectory, his importance to the company's next chapter. My name never came up. Not once. I stood there holding my empty mug, listening to them discuss my mentee as the future while I apparently wasn't even worth mentioning. I told myself it didn't mean anything, that they were just praising good work, but the exclusion stung more than I wanted to admit. Rumors about retention bonuses started spreading about 2 months before the merger was announced. People whispered in hallways about who would get paid, how much, what the criteria would be. I didn't worry much. I had 14 years with the company. I'd survived 3 previous restructurings. I'd built critical operational frameworks that the entire division relied on. I'd trained multiple people who were now in leadership positions. I assumed my track record spoke for itself, that longevity and contribution would be weighted heavily, that the company valued institutional knowledge. I assumed the system would be fair. I assumed wrong. What I didn't understand then was that retention wasn't really about contribution or loyalty. It was about narrative. And the narrative leadership had already decided on was that the future belonged to people like Cameron, young, energetic, untested enough to mold, while people like me were stable, reliable, but ultimately disposable. We were the foundation they could take for granted while they invested in the facade. I started pulling performance data 6 weeks ago, just to understand how things actually measured up. The numbers were stark. Over the past 18 months, I'd closed 41 high-value client projects with an average satisfaction rating of 94%. Cameron had closed 17 projects with an average rating of 87%. I'd personally developed 3 operational frameworks that had been adopted company-wide. Cameron had contributed good analytical work, but nothing that fundamentally changed how we operated. My client retention rate was 96%. His was 81%, which was solid for someone at his experience level but nowhere near exceptional. I'd mentored 6 employees who'd been promoted into leadership roles over the past 4 years. Cameron was still developing his own skills, let alone teaching others. By every objective measure, my impact dwarfed his. Yet in every company communication, every town hall, every strategic update, leadership spotlighted Cameron and others like him. They were the future. They were the innovation. They were the energy the company needed. The narrative they were building had nothing to do with results. It was about optics, about appearing forward-thinking and dynamic. And that narrative required casting experienced employees as the past so the younger ones could be positioned as the future. The numbers didn't lie. But apparently, they didn't matter either. I scheduled a one-on-one with my manager 5 weeks before the retention letters came out. I kept it direct. I've noticed a shift in how leadership talks about the team. I'm getting the sense that something's changed in how my work is being valued. Is there something I should be doing differently? He looked uncomfortable, shifting in his chair and avoiding direct eye contact. You're doing great work. Your performance has been solid. The feedback from clients is excellent. Just trust the process. The merger is creating a lot of uncertainty, but things will settle once we get through the transition. Trust the process. The exact phrase I'd heard in 3 previous conversations over the past 2 months. It was becoming a mantra, a way to deflect questions without actually answering them. I pressed a little. What process, specifically? Is there something being evaluated that I should be aware of? He paused too long before responding. The leadership team is working through retention priorities and resource allocation. It's complex. But you're valued here. Don't read too much into the communication shifts. The conversation ended with vague reassurances and no real information. I left knowing exactly what it meant. Decisions had already been made, and my input was irrelevant. 3 weeks before the retention meeting, I walked past a conference room where HR was working. The door was open, and I could see spreadsheets projected on the wall. Retention bonus amounts, names, terms. Everything already decided. No discussion sessions with managers. No evaluation committees. No negotiation windows. Just a completed spreadsheet with final numbers locked in. I didn't stop. I didn't ask questions. I just kept walking, The image of that spreadsheet burned into my memory. Someone had decided my value, reduced 14 years of contribution to a single number, and moved on. The process my manager kept telling me to trust was already complete. I wasn't being evaluated. I was being informed. There's a massive difference between the two, and understanding that difference changed how I saw everything that followed. The morning after the retention letters were distributed, Cameron avoided me. He didn't stop by my office for his usual coffee and project check-in. He didn't show up at the team meeting. When I finally saw him in the hallway near the elevators late that afternoon, he looked uncomfortable, almost guilty. "Hey, we should talk," he said quietly. We found an empty conference room. He sat down and immediately said, "I didn't know the amounts were different. I mean, I knew we were both getting retention offers, but I didn't realize." He trailed off. "I got the letter last night. 70,000. I signed it because it seemed good, but I didn't know yours was so much less. If I'd known, I would have said something. This feels wrong." I believed him. Cameron wasn't the problem. He hadn't asked to be valued more than me. He didn't design the system. He was just a beneficiary of decisions made by people who saw him as a better investment. But his discomfort didn't change the math. Didn't change the fact that the company had made a deliberate choice about our relative worth. I told him it wasn't his fault, that he should accept the offer and not worry about it. But the conversation confirmed what I already knew. This wasn't an accident. It was policy. I started digging into the retention framework systematically, pulling historical bonus data, policy documents, compensation guidelines. What I found was striking. Over the past 3 years, retention bonuses for employees with 10-plus years of tenure have been capped at $35,000 regardless of performance or role. Meanwhile, employees with less than 5 years of service had no cap, with amounts determined by strategic value assessments and future potential evaluations. The language was deliberately vague. Strategic value wasn't defined by metrics or outcomes. It was subjective, determined by leadership perception and narrative fit. I found records of retention offers from the previous merger 2 years ago. Senior employees with strong track records got $25,000 to $35,000. Junior employees who were perceived as high potential got $50,000 to $80,000. The pattern was consistent and clear. 3 other senior team members had received offers in the same range as mine, all between $28,000 and $35,000. Their younger colleagues, many of whom they'd personally trained, received offers between $55,000 and $75,000. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed. The company had institutionalized a preference for potential over performance, for youth over experience, for narrative over results. Late one night, digging deeper into executive compensation structures, I found something that made everything click into place. Buried in leadership performance metrics was a bonus structure tied to retention outcomes. Executives received additional compensation for successfully retaining high-potential employees under age 35. The metric was explicit, measurable, and directly tied to their personal bonuses. Directors and VPs could earn up to 15% additional annual compensation by hitting retention targets for employees under 35. There was no equivalent metric for retaining senior staff. No bonus for keeping institutional knowledge. No incentive for valuing experience. The system financially rewarded leaders for prioritizing young employees while providing zero motivation to fight for senior staff. Suddenly, the director's focus on Cameron made perfect sense. He wasn't just the future of the division in some abstract philosophical sense. He was literally worth money to her. Real dollars in her compensation package if she could keep him through the merger. I was worth nothing to her financially. Keeping me or losing me had zero impact on her bonus. The policy had turned retention into a game where experience was worthless and youth was currency. I scheduled another meeting with HR, this time bringing printed documentation of the compensation patterns and policy language. The director listened politely as I walked through the data, showing the systematic disparity between senior and junior retention offers. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, then responded in that carefully practiced tone HR professionals use when delivering bad news. The policy is forward-looking. We're investing in employees who will lead the company through its next decade of growth. That requires prioritizing people with longer runways ahead of them. We value your contributions, but our retention dollars are limited, and we have to allocate them strategically toward future leadership development. I kept my voice level. So 14 years of institutional knowledge and proven performance is worth less than 3 years of potential? She didn't flinch. It's worth different things. Your experience is valued, but retention bonuses are specifically designed to lock in future leadership. That's a different calculation than rewarding past contribution. I understood completely then. Loyalty meant nothing. Results meant nothing. The only thing that mattered was fitting the narrative leadership wanted to tell about where the company was going. And that narrative required people like me to be undervalued so people like Cameron could be positioned as the future. I walked out of that meeting knowing exactly what I needed to do. 2 days later, leadership announced a 30-day lock-in period. Any employee who resigned before the merger closed would forfeit their retention bonus entirely, regardless of how much of the commitment period they'd completed. It was a trap designed to prevent people from taking the money and leaving immediately. Sign now, stay locked for 30 days minimum, or lose everything. I sat at my desk and circled the date on my calendar. 30 days from the retention letter distribution. I had 30 days to decide whether $30,000 was worth swallowing the institutional disrespect, worth endorsing a system that had explicitly valued me at less than half of someone I'd trained. 30 days to decide if money mattered more than dignity. A week after receiving the retention offer, I got a carefully worded LinkedIn message from a former colleague who'd moved to a competitor. Heard you might be navigating some changes. Would love to catch up if you're open to a conversation. We met for coffee 3 days later at a place far enough from the office to avoid accidental encounters. She was direct. We're building out our client operations division. We need someone who actually knows how to run complex projects, someone with real institutional knowledge and leadership presence. The title would be Senior Director, lateral to what you're doing now. Base salary would be a 12% increase from your current. Equity package. Standard benefits. What we're really offering is a culture that actually values experience instead of just talking about it. The offer wasn't flashy. It wasn't a dramatic leap. It was just respectful. They wanted what I'd built over 14 years. They wanted my knowledge, my client relationships, my operational expertise. They weren't looking for potential. They were looking for proven capability. I told her I'd think about it, but I already knew the answer was yes. The question was just timing. I spent 2 nearly sleepless nights weighing the decision. $30,000 over 18 months. After taxes, maybe $22,000. Roughly $1,200 per month. Was that worth staying in an organization that had explicitly decided I was worth less than someone who couldn't function without my guidance? Was that worth endorsing a system that had turned age into a liability and experience into something to be managed rather than leveraged? I drafted a resignation email 4 separate times. Each time, I read it over, my finger hovering over the send button, and then I'd close the draft. What stopped me wasn't fear or uncertainty. It was wanting to be absolutely certain. I wanted to give leadership one final opportunity to acknowledge the disparity, to show they understood what they were doing. I wanted to be sure I'd exhausted every reasonable option before walking away. 4 days before my decision deadline, I was pulled into a closed-door merger briefing. The executive team walked through the integration timeline, the systems consolidation schedule, the client communication strategy. As they presented, I realized how much of their plan depended on operational frameworks I'd built over years. Frameworks that existed partially in documentation but largely in my head. The client escalation protocols that kept major accounts from churning. The vendor negotiation strategies that had saved the company millions. The project management methodologies that kept cross-functional teams aligned. Cameron knew pieces of it. He'd watched me execute these processes. But he didn't understand the underlying logic, the historical context, the judgment calls that made them work in practice versus theory. No one in that room had bothered to ask how these systems would function without me. They just assumed they were transferable, that institutional knowledge could be downloaded like software. They were about to learn otherwise. I requested one final meeting with the director who'd championed Cameron's future so enthusiastically. I kept it simple and direct. I'm asking one last time if there's any possibility of reviewing my retention bonus given my tenure, my performance record, and the scope of my contributions to the division's operations. She didn't hesitate, didn't pause to consider, didn't show any uncertainty. The decision is final. We've allocated retention budget according to our strategic priorities, and those priorities are focused on future leadership development. I understand this is disappointing, but I'm asking you to trust that we're making the right long-term decisions for the organization. The same phrase again. Trust the process. Trust the decision. Trust that being undervalued was somehow in my best interest. I nodded slowly. I understand. Thank you for your time. I stood and walked out. If their decision was final, so was mine. At 1:22 a.m., after finishing the last piece of the merger integration roadmap I'd been working on for 3 weeks, I opened my laptop and composed my resignation. 2 paragraphs. Professional. No accusations. No bitterness. No explanations beyond accepting another opportunity. My last day would be in 2 weeks, which meant I'd forfeit the retention bonus entirely. I submitted it through the HR portal, packed my personal belongings into a box, and walked out of the building into the cold pre-dawn air. The parking lot was empty. The city was silent. I sat in my car for a long moment, feeling the weight of the decision settle. No dramatic speech. No emotional confrontation. Just quiet departure. And in that silence, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Clarity. Within 5 days, the operational cracks started showing. A major client called with an escalation requiring the specialized protocol I developed over years of managing their account. Cameron attempted to handle it using the documented process, but documentation only captures procedure, not judgment. The client grew frustrated with his by-the-book responses that didn't address their actual underlying concerns. The situation escalated to the executive team within 48 hours. Other projects began stalling. Vendor negotiations I'd been managing quietly fell apart when my replacement tried to apply standard frameworks to relationships that required institutional context to navigate. Cameron struggled, not because he lacked capability, but because he'd always operated with my safety net. Without it, the gaps in his experience became immediately visible. Leadership started scrambling, realizing too late that systems and people aren't interchangeable, that knowledge can't be transferred through documentation alone. 9 days after I submitted my resignation, my phone rang at 10:34 p.m. The number was the VP of Operations. I let it ring 3 times before answering. His voice was measured, careful. I know you're finishing up your notice period, but I wanted to reach out personally. We've been reviewing your departure and its impact on the integration timeline. Is there any scenario where you'd consider staying? We're open to renegotiating terms. I listened without interrupting as he talked about continuity, about the value I brought, about the operational challenges my absence was creating. Everything he was saying now would have mattered 2 weeks ago. Now it just confirmed what I already knew. They'd undervalued me until the consequences became undeniable. I appreciate the outreach, I said calmly. What specific terms are you considering? The next morning, I received a revised offer. Retention bonus increased to $65,000. Title bump to Senior Director. Expanded responsibilities with direct executive access. Everything they should have offered initially but didn't because they'd assumed I'd stay regardless. I read it carefully, then responded with one condition. I'll consider staying if the company commits to transparent compensation structures for senior staff and corrects the systemic bias against experience in the retention framework. This isn't about my bonus anymore. It's about fixing a broken system that financially incentivizes leaders to undervalue institutional knowledge. The response took 6 hours. When it came, it was from HR, not the VP. We appreciate your feedback on compensation philosophy. However, our retention framework has been approved at the board level and reflects our long-term strategic priorities. We're unable to restructure it at this time. We hope you'll reconsider based on the improved individual offer. They wanted to solve the immediate problem, my departure, without addressing the underlying issue. They wanted to buy my silence about systemic age discrimination by making me an exception. I declined within the hour. The merger deadline came and went with integration delays piling up. Retention bonuses that were supposed to lock in critical talent had failed spectacularly. Junior employees who'd received large bonuses started leaving anyway once they had the first installment and better external offers appeared. They took the money and ran, having no real loyalty to an organization that had simply paid them to stay temporarily. Meanwhile, the senior staff who actually understood how things worked, the people who'd been offered token amounts, were walking out in slow succession. Each departure created operational gaps that couldn't be filled quickly. Leadership began pointing fingers. The director blamed the merger team for poor planning. The merger team blamed operational gaps they'd been assured would be managed. No one wanted to admit the real problem. They'd built a retention strategy around narrative instead of operational reality. 7 weeks after I left, internal reviews exposed the age-based incentive structure. Someone leaked the executive compensation policy showing the under 35 retention bonuses to the broader organization. Employees were furious. The optics were catastrophic. The company was facing potential age discrimination claims. Leadership was forced to restructure the entire retention framework, removing the age-based incentives and implementing objective criteria tied to actual performance metrics and operational criticality. 2 executives quietly exited during the restructuring. The director who'd championed the fresh energy approach was reassigned to a non-operational advisory role with no staff. Careers ended through the slow erosion of credibility rather than dramatic terminations. I accepted the competitor's offer and started 3 weeks after my final day. The work was challenging and respected. The culture valued what I'd built over 14 years rather than discounting it as legacy thinking. 4 months into the new role, a former colleague texted me that Cameron's retention bonus was being clawed back. He'd missed multiple performance targets after I left, and the company had invoked the repayment clause in his agreement. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt sad. Cameron had been set up to fail by a system that valued him for the wrong reasons, that gave him money and visibility without the support structure he needed to actually succeed. He was talented, but he'd been promoted beyond his capability too quickly because he fit a narrative. Now he was paying the price for leadership's mistakes. Looking back now, the moment I chose self-respect over loyalty to a broken system was the moment everything changed. I didn't burn bridges. I didn't sabotage anyone. I didn't leak information or create drama. I simply refused to stay small, to accept being undervalued, to endorse a framework that prioritized optics over contribution. Walking out at 1:22 a.m. wasn't about anger. It was about clarity. The retention bonus wasn't an insult. It was information. It told me exactly how leadership saw me, and once I knew that, I couldn't unknow it. I couldn't keep building systems for people who saw my experience as a liability rather than an asset. I couldn't keep training people who'd be rewarded for my work while I was quietly managed out. Justice came quietly, not through dramatic confrontation but through the natural consequences of decisions made by people who confused potential with value, who mistook youth for capability, who built incentive structures that rewarded image over substance. They wanted fresh energy. They got chaos. They wanted to invest in the future. They lost the present. And I walked forward into a role where my contributions were seen, respected, and compensated fairly. Where experience was valued rather than tolerated. Where institutional knowledge was recognized as the competitive advantage it actually is. That was enough. That was everything.